Jasmine Crockett stood dead center in the Supreme Court chamber, bright lights highlighting her bold red suit as she faced Chief Justice John Roberts Hedden. Her heart was racing, but her eyes completely steady. Just seconds before, Roberts had tried to shut her down with a sharp "Congresswoman. That's enough." His voice bounced off the marble walls like a warning shot. The sudden interruption sent ripples of whispers through the packed courtroom. People exchanging glances, tension filling every corner of the room. Crockett gripped her notes tight, but she didn't flinch. Standing before 9 justices and hundreds of people watching, Roberts, with his lifetime appointment and 18 years running America's highest court, was confident he could silence this first-term representative from Texas. But Crockett, armed with her background as a prosecutor and her unshakable belief in what the Constitution actually says, saw this as her moment to prove him dead wrong for trying to dismiss her. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence, clear and strong. "With all due respect, Mr. Chief Justice, the Constitution doesn't give you permission to silence an elected representative who's talking about voting rights." The room went absolutely silent. Roberts's face froze, clearly not expecting such a direct challenge to his authority based on the Constitution itself. This wasn't just some procedural disagreement anymore. This was about the basic principles of what it means to be a judge and serve the people. And it was Crockett's moment to defend not just herself, but the very idea of democratic representation against what looked like judicial overreach. The Supreme Court chamber glowed with that serious formal lighting. The audience falling into a tense hush as Chief Justice John Roberts sat right in the middle of the 9 justices. His black robe was perfectly pressed, his gaze sharp and full of authority. The camera slowly panned across the room, catching scattered whispers rising from the gallery as the court clerk announced, "The Honorable Court recognizes Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, appearing as friend of the court." Roberts gave a slight nod, a tight smile barely visible as he said, "Representative Crockett from Texas's 30th District. You have 10 minutes. His tone carried all the weight of his position. A conservative-leaning Chief Justice appointed by President Bush back in 2005. Known for his careful step-by-step approach to legal decisions and his focus on managing how the public sees the court. Jasmine Crockett walked up to the podium with measured steps, her red suit standing out dramatically against the dark wood interior of the chamber. At 42, this freshman Congresswoman from Dallas carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years as a civil rights attorney and state representative. Known for her direct, no-nonsense style, she'd quickly made a name for herself as a rising voice on constitutional issues, especially voting rights, the very issue at the heart of today's hearing. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," she began, her deep voice filling the chamber. "I stand before you today, not just as a congresswoman, but as someone who's seen with her own eyes how the destruction of voting rights has taken away the voices of communities across Texas and our entire nation." She paused, making eye contact with each justice before continuing. "The case you're looking at today isn't just about technical rules and regulations. It's about whether we still believe in the basic promise that all Americans deserve equal access to cast their ballots." Roberts shifted slightly in his chair, his expression unchanged, but his eyes narrowing just a tiny bit, almost invisible unless you were really watching. This hearing on Williams versus Texas Election Commission wasn't supposed to be some high-profile case. It was technical about voter ID requirements, something Roberts probably hoped would pass with barely any public attention. But Crockett getting involved had changed everything, bringing national media attention and a courtroom packed with people. Crockett stepped slightly to the side, pointing at the Constitution displayed in the chamber. As she continued, "When the Voting Rights Act was gutted by this very court in Shelby County, we were promised that other protections would still be there. Yet here we are 10 years later, seeing exactly the kind of voter suppression the VRA was designed to prevent." The audience tensed up as Roberts leaned forward, his microphone catching his sharp breath at her direct reference to one of his most controversial decisions. The stakes of this confrontation suddenly became crystal clear. This wasn't just about one specific case. It was a direct challenge to the entire Roberts Court's approach to voting rights law. Justice Elena Kagan glanced over at Roberts, then back at Crockett, her expression suggesting she could see the brewing confrontation coming. Justice Thomas sat perfectly still while Justice Jackson suddenly leaned forward, clearly engaged by what Crockett was saying. The political divisions of the court were becoming visible in real time. "The Texas law in front of you today," Crockett continued, her voice getting stronger, "creates barriers that hit Black and Latino voters the hardest. My constituents and the evidence is overwhelming. When 23% of black Texans don't have the specific ID this law requires, compared to just 4.7% of white Texans, we're not talking about neutral regulations. We're talking about a modern-day poll tax. Roberts' jaw tightened as cameras caught his growing discomfort. This wasn't the dry, technical, legal argument he'd expected. Crockett was speaking in plain language about racial disparities in a way that hit home with the people watching. Even worse for Roberts, she was backing up every single point with specific numbers and constitutional principles. Congresswoman, he cut in. His tone clipped. Please stick to the specific legal questions the court is considering. The first attempt to redirect her had been made. A subtle warning that she was going into territory the Chief Justice wanted to avoid. Crockett nodded respectfully but didn't back down. Mr. Chief Justice, the specific legal question is whether this law violates the 14th and 15th Amendments. And we can't answer that without talking about these disparities. She didn't miss a beat, turning back to her notes. When 87-year-old veterans who voted in every single election since coming home from Korea suddenly can't cast a ballot, we've got a constitutional crisis on our hands. The gallery erupted in murmurs, quickly silenced by the bang of Roberts's gavel. The confrontation was now fully out in the open. Crockett, the rising congressional star and former civil rights attorney, was challenging Roberts. The Chief Justice working to reshape American election law. This wasn't just a legal argument anymore. It was a fundamental clash over who gets to define what constitutional voting protections actually mean. As cameras captured the tension, political reporters' fingers were flying across keyboards. CNN's on-screen text already read, "Showdown at Skatas." Crockett challenges Roberts on voting rights. The stage was set for a constitutional confrontation that would soon explode across America's political landscape. The tension in the Supreme Court chamber kept building as Crockett continued her presentation, methodically laying out how the Texas voter ID law created barrier after barrier for minority voters. She stood firm, gesturing to data charts her team had prepared, showing stark racial differences in voter access across Texas counties. When we look at how this law actually works in practice, she explained, her voice steady and clear. We find that in counties with higher Black and Latino populations, DMV offices, where you get a valid ID, have cut hours, super long wait times, and they're often located miles away from public transportation. This isn't some accident. It's a pattern that repeats all across the state. Robert shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with how directly Crockett was addressing racial disparities. The Chief Justice had long preferred talking about voting regulations without bringing race into it, focusing instead on states' rights to run their own elections. Crockett's approach was forcing exactly the conversation he'd spent years trying to avoid. Congresswoman, he interrupted again, his tone sharper this time. The court is aware of the general statistics. Please address the specific constitutional test that should apply to this case. This wasn't just him trying to redirect the conversation procedurally. It was an attempt to move the discussion away from real people's experiences and back to abstract legal doctrine. The gallery tensed up, recognizing the first real clash between the powerful Chief Justice and the freshman Congresswoman. Justice Barrett glanced at Roberts while Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, watching Crockett with clear interest. Crockett paused, took a sip of water, and nodded respectfully. Mr. Chief Justice, I'm addressing exactly the constitutional test under both Arlington Heights and what's left of the Voting Rights Act. Discriminatory impact combined with historical patterns creates a presumption that requires strict scrutiny. She hadn't backed down one bit. Instead, she connected her evidence directly to legal precedent. Roberts's face tightened just slightly, almost imperceptibly. The court is well versed in the precedents. Congresswoman, with respect, Your Honor, Crockett replied, her voice gaining strength. Precedent only matters when it's actually applied. In Bruno, this court acknowledged discriminatory impact, but still upheld Arizona's regulations. On establishing why this case requires a different outcome based on how severe the impact is. The first real wave of murmurs is spread through the courtroom. Crockett had directly referenced another controversial Roberts Court decision that had weakened voting protections. Cameras capture Justice Kagan nodding slightly while Justice Allo frowned, creating a split-screen moment that would later go viral. Roberts tapped his microphone. Congresswoman Crockett, this court decides cases based on constitutional principles, not policy preferences. Please continue with your legal argument. His tone had grown dismissive, almost condescending, a tactical mistake that would soon become obvious. Crockett nodded, then turned to her most powerful evidence. "Let me show you what constitutional principles look like in real life, Your Honor." She signaled to her aide, who handed out documents to the justices. "Before you are sworn statements from 72 Texas voters who were denied their right to vote despite making multiple good faith efforts to comply with this law." She held up the first statement. Mary Wilson, 84 years old, born at home in East Texas in 1939 when birth certificates weren't commonly given to black babies in the Jim Crow South. She's voted in every election since 1965, but got turned away in 2022 because her name on her baptismal certificate, the only record of her birth, has a different middle initial than her Social Security card. Crockett moved to the next document. James Fentes, a disabled veteran who couldn't renew his license because the only DMV within 50 miles of his rural home isn't wheelchair accessible. They told him to drive to the next county. With each example, Crockett was doing something powerful. Connecting abstract legal principles to real human experiences, making the constitutional violations impossible to brush off as mere technicalities. The gallery was completely captivated, and several journalists were openly recording every word. Robertson's patience was clearly wearing thin. He glanced at the clock, then interrupted again. "Congresswoman, individual stories, while compelling, don't establish a constitutional pattern. We need to address the legal standard, not emotional appeals." The dismissal of these voters' experiences as emotional appeals created exactly the opening Crockett had been waiting for. She straightened her shoulders, looked directly at Roberts, and delivered her first truly confrontational response. "Mr. Chief Justice, with all due respect, the Constitution wasn't written for abstract legal theories. It was written to protect real Americans like Ms. Wilson and Mr. Fuentes. When the 15th Amendment says the right to vote shall not be denied or limited based on race, it doesn't include an exception for inconvenient facts or uncomfortable truths." The gallery exploded in whispers. Justice Jackson looked up sharply while Justice Thomas, usually silent, whispered something to Justice Alito. The confrontation had now escalated beyond procedural disagreement into fundamental questions about how constitutional principles should actually be interpreted. Roberts' face flushed slightly as he reached for his gavel. "Congresswoman, I'll remind you that this is a legal proceeding, not a congressional hearing. Please maintain appropriate decorum." Rather than backing down, Crockett nodded and doubled down. "Appropriate decorum, Your Honor, includes acknowledging the human impact of constitutional violations. I'm not here for abstract theory. I'm here because real voters in my district are being systematically denied their most fundamental right." She turned to Justice Barrett. "Justice Barrett, in your confirmation hearing, you said the right to vote is a fundamental constitutional guarantee. Yet the law in front of you today has demonstrably prevented thousands of eligible voters from exercising that right. How can that possibly survive constitutional review?" Roberts immediately stepped in, his voice sharp. "Congresswoman Crockett, you will address your arguments to the court as a whole, not individual justices, and you will stop asking the justices questions directly." The tension in the room hit a breaking point. Roberts was now clearly frustrated, having tried multiple times to control Crockett's presentation without success. The constitutional separation of powers was being tested in real time. A Chief Justice trying to assert control over a member of Congress who flat out refused to be silenced. Crockett nodded again, but her expression stayed resolute. "I apologize for the direct question, Mr. Chief Justice. Let me rephrase for the entire court. How can any law that demonstrably prevents thousands of eligible voters from casting their ballots possibly survive review under the 14th and 15th Amendments?" Roberts leaned forward, his patience clearly exhausted. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have repeatedly disregarded the court's guidance on how to present your argument. If you cannot follow this court's procedures, your time will be cut short." The threat hung in the air. A Chief Justice threatening to silence an elected representative of the people during a hearing about voting rights. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the gallery where several civil rights leaders were sitting. Cameras captured everything, including the reactions of the other justices, several of whom looked uncomfortable with Roberts's approach. Crockett stood perfectly still for a moment, then reached into her folder and pulled out a document nobody in that room expected, a copy of the Constitution itself. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice now calm but firm. "Before you cut my time short, I think we should both refresh ourselves. on a document that comes before both your authority and mine. The Supreme Court chamber fell into an intense silence as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett held up the Constitution, her steady gaze locked on Chief Justice Roberts. The moment crackled with tension, a freshman representative facing down the nation's top judicial officer with the founding document between them. Mr. Chief Justice Crockett began, her voice clear and unwavering. Article 1 of this Constitution establishes Congress as a co-equal branch of government. When I speak here today, I'm not just doing so as an attorney before the court, but as a representative of 750,000 Americans whose voting rights are directly affected by this case. Roberts's expression darkened. Congresswoman, your status as a member of Congress doesn't grant you special privilege in this courtroom. All advocates before this court are subject to the same rules. Crockett didn't hesitate. With respect, Your Honor, it doesn't grant me special privilege, but it does grant me a constitutional duty to speak for my constituents when their fundamental rights are being threatened. She held the Constitution higher. The founders created 3 co-equal branches specifically to prevent anyone from silencing another. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Several justices shifted uncomfortably. Justice Kagan's eyebrows went up slightly while Justice Sotomayor leaned forward with obvious interest. Roberts's face flushed with barely contained frustration. He tapped his gavel sharply. Congresswoman Crockett, this is my final warning. Address the legal questions before this court or I will end your argument. What happened next would become the moment replayed on every news channel within the hour. Crockett, instead of backing down, carefully opened her copy of the Constitution to a marked page. Mr. Chief Justice, she said, her voice now stronger and more deliberate. I am addressing the most fundamental legal question before not just this court, but our entire democracy. Article 1, Section 2 establishes that members of Congress directly represent the people. The 15th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote based on race. And the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under law. She took a step closer to the bench. When you threaten to silence me for speaking about how my constituents are being denied their constitutional right to vote, you're not just violating court procedure. You're embodying the very constitutional crisis I came here to address. Complete silence fell over the chamber. The confrontation had moved beyond a mere disagreement about courtroom rules. Crockett had masterfully reframed the entire exchange as a constitutional struggle between branches of government, with herself defending democratic representation against judicial overreach. Roberts sat motionless, clearly caught off guard by this constitutional framing of his attempts to control her presentation. Before he could respond, Crockett continued, her voice gathering strength. The Texas law before you today has prevented an estimated 278,000 eligible voters from casting ballots. In my district alone, 42,000 voters, predominantly Black and Latino Americans, have faced barriers that the 15th Amendment explicitly forbids. This isn't about procedure, Your Honor. This is about whether the Constitution's promises are real or just theoretical. She turned to address the full court, a tactical move that prevented Roberts from appearing to be her sole opponent. This court has said that voting is preservative of all rights. If you rule that states can create barriers that demonstrably prevent hundreds of thousands of eligible Americans from voting, particularly when those barriers disproportionately impact racial minorities, then what exactly does the 15th Amendment protect? Justice Jackson nodded almost imperceptibly while Justice Barrett appeared to be taking detailed notes. The dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Crockett was no longer on the defensive. By appealing directly to constitutional principles, she put Roberts in the position of seeming to oppose the very document they'd all sworn to uphold. Roberts tried to regain control. Congresswoman, your time is nearly expired. Please conclude your argument. I'll conclude with this, Mr. Chief Justice Crockett replied, her voice now resonating with conviction. The Texas law requires forms of ID that 23% of Black Texans and 27% of Latino Texans don't have, compared to just 4.7% of white Texans. It closes ID offices in minority neighborhoods while keeping them open in mostly white areas. It rejects tribal IDs while accepting gun licenses. She paused, making eye contact with each justice. If a law systematically prevents one racial group from voting at 3 to 5 times the rate of another, it violates the plain text of the 15th Amendment. And if this court can't see that, then it's not interpreting the Constitution. It's rewriting it. Roberts' face hardened. Congresswoman Crockett, that's enough. Your time has expired. This was the moment. Roberts's attempt to cut her off, to silence an elected representative discussing constitutional voting protections, the very act that would soon be condemned across the nation and ignite a firestorm about judicial overreach. Crockett stood perfectly still, holding the Constitution in one hand and her microphone in the other. Rather than arguing or getting defensive, she simply stated, "Chief Justice, the Constitution doesn't give you the authority to silence an elected representative discussing the 15th Amendment and a case about voting rights. That amendment exists precisely because people in power have always tried to silence those fighting for equal representation." If you found this breakdown of the historic confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and John Roberts enlightening, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth political analysis. Comment below with your thoughts on this constitutional showdown and who you think might be the next person to make headlines defending voting rights at the highest levels of government. Your engagement helps us keep bringing you these crucial stories about the ongoing fight to protect America's democratic foundations. Retry. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.